This presentation is to inform you about the protection of human subjects in research. First, some historical background. It begins with World War II. The first guiding principles for the protection of human subjects started with international agreements. These were based and initiated as a result of the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code in 1947. Later, in 1964, was the Declaration of Helsinki. These codes, this declaration, was based on medical research, and it was in order to protect humans from being experimented on. These principles later then developed into what we use for social science research, including education research. Later in the United States, again, as a result of medical trials and what was known as the Tuskegee case, the Belmont Report in 1979 developed. This then later was manifested in what's known as the Code of Federal Regulations. And again, this is in the United States, but some of the regulations and the principles that were developed through the Belmont Report have been developed and modeled in other countries as well. With the Belmont Report and the Code of Federal Regulations, this was when these protection for human subjects, not only in medical research, but also for research for social science and education, were developed. So the Belmont Report in the United States is really the foundation of what we use to guide how we protect human subjects in social science research and in educational research. So in order to understand these principles, we have to take a look at the three basic ethical principles of the Belmont Report. The first is respect for persons. This means that basically this means that people are entering into research voluntarily, that they're not being forced to do so, and they're not being unknowingly included in research. This is related to informed consent. So all participants must give their consent in order to be part of research. The second principle is beneficence, and this is the basic idea of doing no harm and to maximize possible benefits. So this is also somewhat linked to the Hippocratic Oath that medical doctors would use, this idea that above all, we are not trying to do harm. No harm should be done as a result of our research. The third basic ethical principle is justice. And this is focused on the careful selection of subjects, in particular to ensure that there are no biases in selection. For example, that there's not a particular racial group that is being selected for no particular reason, just because they're easier to get access to, or just because perhaps they are not knowing about their rights. So these are the three basic ethical principles that really govern how we protect human subjects in all sorts of social science and educational research. So let's go a little bit deeper into this connection to research and education. In the United States, colleges and universities follow the Code of Federal Regulations, which particular components of it which refer to public welfare and the protection of human subjects. Human subjects is basically referring to any research that involves interaction with people. So we can see that this is really broad, and in particular for research in education, which we're always dealing with people, it means that we need to be particularly sensitive to and aware of how we are protecting those participants in our studies. The Belmont Report gives us this general rule that if there's any sort of activity in research that's involving human subjects, that activity needs to undergo a review to ensure that the way in which the research is being done, the subjects are being protected, and also to ensure that the subjects are being selected in an appropriate way, and that no harm is being done. When we consider risks in any sort of research, we can consider that there's a range between a low, moderate to extreme risk, and those can be associated with different types of research methods. If we look at this through the lens of educational research, generally the type of research that is done is considered to be low risk. However, some research can be moderate risk or maybe even extreme risk, depending on what it is that we are studying. In particular, moderate risk could be more common if we are doing some sort of study about students' grades, if we're doing something about drug use in school and the effects on attendance, for example. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be paying attention to as researchers in education. However, it's important to remember that even though it is at a low risk, we still have to follow these principles, these guiding principles of the Belmont Report, and ensure that we are getting consent and that our research is being reviewed. So, as I mentioned before, most U.S. universities, they follow these regulations that have been set up by the United States government. And the United States government has set up regulations for all sorts of research that receives federal funding. So because of the blurred lines in many universities about the funding they receive from the United States government, they just protect themselves by requiring that all universities follow the guidelines set up by the government. The main outcome of this is that universities have an institutional review board, or an IRB. And so all researchers, as a result of this, have the responsibility to get approval. They need to be getting informed consent from their subjects before they can begin their research. And that is part of our responsibility as researchers as well. Just briefly about institutional review boards. These are committees that review research proposals that involve human subjects, and again, to ensure that they follow guidelines to make sure that the subjects are being protected, that there's not been some sort of bias in the selection, that it is not going to do harm to the subjects, and that they are voluntary, that they have given their consent. Wilkes University also has an IRB, and as other IRBs, they review and oversee all the research involving human subjects. So this is part of the process that we would go through in order to do our research. So again, just to leave with this reminder that any type of research, any activity that involves human subjects needs to undergo a review in order to ensure that we are protecting our participants, to ensure that they are not being harmed by what we are doing, and to ensure that there is not any sort of bias in our use of subjects. And here are the references that I used. Thank you very much.